Welcome back to the Free Code Camp podcast. I'm Quincy Larson, teacher and founder of freeCodeCamp.org. Today is October 10th, 2025. We're doing episode number 192. And today we're talking with the creator of the popular Vue JavaScript front-end development framework and the Vite open source project, none other than open source legend, Evan You. Hyped to talk with him, but first, let's go through some quick community news. FreeCodeCamp just published a new in-depth course that will teach you full-stack development fundamentals from the ground up. It covers front-end development tools like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Then it moves to back-end development tools like Node, SQL, and TypeScript. You can code along at home and build a variety of projects while getting exposed to a ton of concepts. How are we going to cover all that in one video course? Well, here's the catch. The video course is 48 hours long. Don't attempt to go through the whole thing in one sitting. As with everything on FreeCodeCamp, it's totally free. You can check it out with a link in the description after you finish this podcast. Next, FreeCodeCamp also completed work on a big, ambitious Go programming course where you build your own movie streaming app. Go is a fast back-end language, and here we're pairing it with the Gin-Gonic web server framework. I think it's related to like gin and tonic is the inspiration for the name. As you go through this project, you'll also integrate your movie database with OpenAI's API to analyze data and give your users personalized movie recommendations. So instead of a traditional, maybe user feedback related recommendation engine or collaborative filtering system, it's just using LLM output, which saves a lot of steps. I'm not sure if the quality will be nearly as high, but for the purpose of this limited scope project, I think it's great. Next, have you ever been browsing the web and seen an error message that says something like blocked by CORS policy? Well, what is CORS? CORS stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing. When fetching data, if the domain of the requester is different from the domain of the receiver, your browser will reject that request. It's an important security measure, but it's also a headache for developers trying to maintain their web apps. Luckily, FreeCodeCamp just published this tutorial chock full of theory and code examples to help you understand the basics. We also published a tutorial that will help you decode the buzzword salad. You've probably heard terms like deep learning, machine learning, and generative AI, but what do they mean in relation to one another? This quick article breaks down the jargon for you in a plain English approach with lots of diagrams. And essentially it's kind of like a big nested Russian doll, if you're familiar with what those look like. To some extent, you could say that like machine learning is the superset of, deep learning, and generative AI is underneath that. And yeah, it's going to give you a feel for how these different terms relate to one another. It's worth the 10-minute read, in my opinion. Link in the description. And if you want to learn a little bit more about like low-level programming, look no further than this awesome YouTube video that I discovered where a developer builds the classic arcade game Zaxxon in assembly language. Essentially, they basically don't even have an operating system. They write it like to run right on top of the BIOS. It's really cool. 15-minute watch, link in the description. And then song of the week, Do the Dance Bilyong On Koyangi, which basically means borrowed cat in Korean. So this is a K-pop song by the group Illit that just came out during the summer 2025. And it's a future funk song. Like if you like future funk, if you've ever even heard of future funk, this song, check it out by all means. And basically what future funk is it's super sped up 1980s Japanese city pop songs with like heavy kick drum ducking. So you really feel the bass. I love it. It's perfect to work to. Link to the song in the description. And I want to tell you this FreeCodeCamp shirt I'm wearing that I wear in every episode of the podcast, you can get one too. And you can rep our open source community with pride. We have free shipping anywhere in the US. $20 gets you a tri-blend shirt, very high quality. These last like 100 plus washes in the washing machine. I have like 5 of these and I just keep washing them and wearing them every day. And you can get yours and it will be personally screen printed by Rafael Hernandez, who runs the FreeCodeCamp Spanish podcast, if you've ever listened to that, if you're bilingual. And he also runs a screen printing business in Virginia. So go to shop.freecodecamp.org. We're not shipping outside the US yet. It's a pain, frankly, and it's unreliable. and like dramatically increases the cost. If you are outside the US and you just want to print a shirt for yourself for personal, non-commercial use, you can go to the FreeCodeCamp assets library and just grab one. And, we're not going to come after you for doing that. Knock yourself out. So, but if you want a good, like high quality one, handmade, go to shop.freecodecamp.org. All right. And that brings us to Evan Yu, the creator of the popular Vue JavaScript library for front-end development and the Vite JavaScript build tool that a lot of devs use as kind of a boilerplate for their new projects. Evan is a self-taught developer based in Singapore. He shares tips for getting involved in open source, leading open source projects, and attracting sponsors, which he's very good at, by the way, and how to use AI as a thinking assistant rather than just as a coding assistant. We also talk about his thoughts on the Chinese open source developer scene and a new documentary that just came out about Vite and his new project, Void Zero. Evan Yu, welcome to the FreeCodeCamp podcast.
Yeah, great to be here.
Yeah, so people know you as the creator of Vue, the creator of Vite, the founder of Void Zero, your new company, but a lot of people don't realize you are a self-taught developer. Can you talk a little bit about how you taught yourself programming and what got you interested in working like at all these different layers of the stack and really optimizing tools?
Yeah, I would say I'm an accidental developer because I started out thinking I'm going to be a designer. I was interested in graphics design, motion design, quite early on. Actually, someone taught me Flash when I was maybe in just getting into middle school. I found it really exciting, so I just played with Flash a lot. I use it to like build these slides for my class representations. And then I started looking into how can I control the play positions. So I started using ActionScript. It was like really simple scripting, but I found it interesting. I actually got exposure to some programming around that time when like there was a class in the school that taught Turbo Pascal. And I had no interest in it at all. I was like, this is boring. I just want to play with Flash. But eventually when I was in, then for undergrad, my degree was in art history. Thought I was gonna, get a bit more like graphic design, arty stuff. But around that time when I was graduating, my thesis project was actually related to new media art. So there was this like wave of, artists that were making art with code, right? So people making algorithmic animations, installations and stuff. So I was really fascinated by that. And I eventually did my thesis project with Flash. And in order to do it, I actually had to learn ActionScript a bit more seriously. So I taught myself ActionScript 3, which turns out to be a pretty serious language. It looked kind of like C#, and it was actually originally designed as ECMAScript 4, which is the version of JavaScript that never shipped. So that was more or less my actual exposure to more serious programming. I also took like one computer science class in college that was in Java, a lot of algorithms, and I kind of hated it. So I really never consider myself a sort of hardcore programmer that's interested in like solving algorithmic problems. And eventually, I think after college, I went to Parsons because honestly, art history is hard to find a job, especially as an international student. Because I was born in China, I went to U.S. for college, and so I went to grad school, Parsons in New York, for a Master of Fine Arts in Design and Technology. It's a sort of a program that teaches you both design and a bit of code. It's a little bit of everything. It's a pretty interesting and wild program with people coming from all different backgrounds. Very fun, very chaotic. Also, you kind of just have to figure out what you want to do eventually yourself. It doesn't tell you what you're supposed to do. But around that time, the programming they taught, they're processing, which is a thin layer on top of Java. And there's open frameworks, which is based on C++. So both of these are used to build interactive applications. but deploying them was very difficult. Like you have to compile on a specific machine, and to present it, you just have to bring your machine there, literally, because it won't run on other people's machine. Or you have to send a binary over, which is also very annoying. So around that time, Google started to land all these new APIs, HTML5 stuff in the browser, right, in Chrome. And they started building these interesting things called Chrome experiments, right? Demoing like 3D stuff in the browser, like physics simulation, interesting visual effects using Canvas. So I was like, look, like we can do all of these things just in the browser. So I should learn JavaScript. And now I can build stuff and just share it with people just through a URL, right? That's like way easier than compiling C++. Um, I also kind of really didn't like C++ at all because like of all the memory management. So yeah, then I taught myself JavaScript and CSS and HTML, mostly just because I was designing stuff and trying to build stuff, and I just feel like, okay, I need to actually build these stuff myself, because like we had these collaboration projects, but like no one wants to build other people's stuff, so you kind of have to just build it yourself. Yeah. So I bought the ECMAScript JavaScript, the definitive guide from O'Reilly, the book with the rhino on the cover. Read that book on my commute to and from school. Taught myself JavaScript. Yeah. And that's, where I started doing more JavaScript programming.
Yeah, that is the famous O'Reilly book that's like really thick, and then
Yep.
they have like JavaScript the complete guide, and then like there's a picture of like JavaScript the good parts like right next to it. And it's like so small compared in thickness compared to the definitive guide. So that's really cool. The notion of like a young Evan Yu sitting on a bus like reading the JavaScript definitive guide on its way to essentially design school. So you have this design sensibilities, and one of the big things you've done that has earned so much respect from developers is you've dramatically simplified the developer experience. And I would say, like, based on my perspective, that's like a hallmark of it. You're just making it a lot easier and a lot faster to get things done in the web. Can you talk about like how design school and like that kind of like designer's eye and that understanding of art and art history, aesthetics, process, like how that fed into the initial success of Vue and your other projects?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. One thing that I was taught, I still don't consider myself a good graphic designer. Like when I worked at Google, we had proper graphic designers working next to me. I was like, well, I will never be this good. But the things I was actually taught in design school is design is actually problem solving in a way. It's just creative problem solving. But in order to design something, you have to define the problem first, right? So programming or building an open source project is the same way. You have to define what problem you want to solve first, and then come up with a good solution to it. And just like you have to justify why you approach a certain design this way, you have to justify why you are building this open source project this way, right? You kind of have to have a sort of analytical process of comparing like what objectives and what are different approaches you explored, what existing prior arts there is, right? So that's one aspect. The other is I'm a bit more end result driven. When the reason I got into design is because I just like good looking stuff. Similar to open source projects, I care a lot about the first impression of the API that's presented, the onboarding experience. So, which is why when I build things, I often just sort of have a prototype very early on to, even if it's rough, even if like I just fake stuff to sort of simulate the end developer experience that I wanted for myself. Then I kind of reverse engineer from that, end experience to the necessary implementation details, right? So it's probably very different from some engineers who would like start from the bottom up, kind of like let's build the building blocks, then we compose it into the final thing, which it's a slightly different mindset. And also because I had no like even into my Google years, I still like don't fully consider myself like a, you know, like complete engineer. So I was able to approach a lot of, especially for web development, right? I think I just have a lot of more, similarity to people who got into web development from non-engineering backgrounds. So designers who were initially just playing with HTML, CSS, but slowly getting into actual web development, or people who similar to me who never learned proper, like never got a computer science degree, but still doing web development now. So I think like my perspective, kind of aligns a bit more with these people. And so when I'm designing APIs, I tend to think like, what is the minimal thing that just allows me to do the thing I want, right? And try to cut or hide away the complexities, sometimes necessary complexities, but try to find ways to just hide them until it is like, but we still like provide you the escape hatches as you get more advanced later.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So you have to define the problem before you can solve it. Is
Yeah.
one of the takeaways there, and I would say the process you described is almost kind of like landing page driven development. If you
Yeah.
want to think about it that like, and the benefit of that in my mind is there are so many people that are building things that people don't necessarily want or care about or even understand. Oh, I didn't even realize I had this problem. And if you have to explain to somebody that they have this problem, then it's already
Mm-hmm.
like an additional step. The
Yeah.
world doesn't want vitamins, they want painkillers, right?
Mm-hmm.
um, so I think the approach you're taking of just like figuring out what the actual problem you're solving is first, and then working backward from that is very much in line with like a lot of like Y Combinator's build something people want,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of that, and I like the idea of just like I often do like press release driven development in the sense like how am I
Mm-hmm.
going to explain this to the community, and then work backward. Okay, so then what do we actually need to do to make
Yeah.
this press release like actually a reality? Like, and when I
Mm-hmm.
say press release, just like a tweet or something like that, right? Announcing
Yeah.
some sort of feature. Um, and that brings me to a problem that you identified pretty early when you
Mm-hmm.
were building software, and that is that build tools at the time were pretty limited. You were spending a lot of time waiting for things to load.
Mm-hmm.
You were spent like things that you thought were unnecessary. Can you
Mm-hmm.
describe build tools and why we need build tools for the web?
Yeah, definitely. I think like if someone got into web development like 15 years ago, they probably would just write, some people still like it that way. You can just write JavaScript, you put it on inside an HTML page, and it just works, right? JavaScript runs natively in the browser. But JavaScript was a language that was designed in 10 days, not really intended for serious engineering when it was first, designed. But we ended up building more and more larger applications, larger, more complex applications on the web, right? So people saw what's possible with things like Gmail. And then we started having all these important apps that we're using now, all built using web technologies, right? Figma, uh, you know, um, Figma is an example. Google productivity stuff, Google Docs, Riverside that we're using right now, right? A lot of these traditional applications that we thought had to be done on the desktop are now built with web technologies. So the scope of what's possible on the web expanded very rapidly, and people are building real, serious engineering projects using web technologies. But JavaScript was a language that was not really designed for this purpose. It had to evolve, and so there are certain, different kind of problems, right? There's the first of all, there's the modularity problem. Like you can't just stuff all your JavaScript in a single file. It just doesn't work, right? You have to break it up into smaller pieces. So there comes the problem of bundling. You need to like stitch all these files together into one big file so that the browser can run it again. But then comes the problem of how do you have these? How do you make one file so each file contains variables? You don't want them to be all in the global scope. That would become unmanageable. So you now need to have imports and exports between modules, right? And when you put all these things together, you also want to avoid loading the things that you haven't actually used. So there's like something called tree shaking. or dead code elimination, right? And when you ship JavaScript, you also don't want your page to load too slowly by sending too many bytes. So you have to compress them. Minification, right? So there are all these concerns. And then there's like when JavaScript came out with new standards, new features, right? We got ES5, ES 2016, 17. Some of the new features, they are in the spec, but the browsers don't support them yet. Now you have to transpile. And then we realize, okay, like without type information, it's really hard to manage stuff. So there came TypeScript. Now you have to transpile TypeScript. And then React, came around as like there's JSX. So there are all of these little things. Now you have to rely on a build step, right? But putting all these things together and make it just work is very complicated, at least in the early days. So you kind of have to rely on multiple different tools, right? So you have to rely on things like Webpack, Babel, unit tests you need Jest, you need to have a ton of Babel plugins to transpile your stuff. You maybe transpile some of it with TypeScript, some of it with the Babel, and then you have to put them together. You have to add in a minifier to eventually compress the stuff. So, and all of these things are made by different people, maintained by different parties. Someone has to assemble them together, and there was no standard, so everyone kind of pretty much just like, pick and choose all these different things, put them together. And for Vue, we actually worked on something called Vue CLI, which is essentially a more opinionated stack that we chose for Vue users. We essentially say, okay, like if you use Vue and you want to build step, this is the recommended solution that we've like encapsulated all these different things inside this one single CLI that you can use. And that was before Vite. Yeah. There was a lot of complexity in there, and it was based on a bundler called Webpack. And in a way, we maintained Vue CLI for a very long time. And it was a lot of work. And at one point, people are also building just bigger and bigger apps with Vue, right? So what we realized is we invented a lot of these tools. The JavaScript developers wrote the tools for ourselves using JavaScript. JavaScript is a dynamic language. It's decently fast, right? But when you are writing, say, thousands of modules, shipping megabytes of JavaScript-based tools will eventually be slow. It's single-threaded, right? So one day I was, got to the point where I was just downloading a bug reproduction by a user, and it took me like 2 minutes to install all the dependencies, and then like 20 seconds to boot up the dev server. And I was like, well, there's got to be a faster way to do this, or a simpler way to do this, right? So that's kind of the initial, thing that led me to think about the idea of Vite in the first place.
Wow, so a lot to kind of recap there, but I'm going to attempt to do it just for the benefit of everybody tuning in. So you can still write JavaScript the old-fashioned way, and plenty of people do. I go to plenty of people's personal websites, and they may use minimal JavaScript. It's kind of like there's like the kind of like austerity chic or brutalism, web brutalism, and stuff like that, right? The bare concrete. And you can still do it that way. Everything's backward compatible, essentially, but the way you describe the tools gradually becoming more and more complicated, it is a necessity. You're trying to accomplish more and more complicated things, so naturally you need more and more tooling. You need to import more and more megabytes of packages and libraries to be able to build something as sophisticated as Figma, for example, that runs in the browser. And my understanding is they've spent tons of developer hours really building out a lot of custom tooling to be able to do something as powerful as Figma in the browser, right? Obviously, you mentioned Gmail, and that was like the big breakthrough with like Ajax and stuff like that. And before that, nobody really took web apps seriously. The notion was you needed to have, shrink wrap software or something like that. And after that, there's the big rush. Like Microsoft moved Office to the cloud to try to compete with Google Docs and stuff like that. So you kind of like walked us through an entire progression of really like a decade or so of releases of new JavaScript specs in the form of various ECMAScript lines and things like that. And then you described the process as of like just before creating Vite, where now you're trying to like do this as a dev. You're trying to actually work and like essentially load up somebody's PR and get all the dependencies installed, and you're spending minutes and minutes trying to do this very simple task because that complexity it's almost like there's a tremendous amount of technical debt associated with that very hodgepodge organic process. And so it sounds like what you're trying to do with Vite and with some of the other tooling you're building is go back and like post facto like add more reason to that hodgepodge. Is that an accurate description? Like you're coming in with more opinionation, if that's
I tend to think, you know, JavaScript ecosystem is a sort of like Wild West in the beginning, right? Everyone just like come up with his like their own solutions. I think it's a double-edged sword. It's like it's a blessing and a curse. The blessing is, you know, there's unlimited creativity. Everyone just like building their stuff to solve their own problems, which is beautiful. Like when you see all these different solutions and interesting ideas just popping up, there's cross pollination, like people just like inspire each other. You know, it's great, right? The downside is as an average developer or a beginner, right, we're just faced with this like sort of, you know, choice, so overwhelming amount of choices that you're just like, what do I even use? I don't even know where to start, right? And when you eventually put things together, there's also these like little, you know, very subtle issues of compatibility between these different pieces because they were not designed by the same people. They some of the things may even not designed to work the same way, you know. So over time, you know, like when you put all these things together, you know, it just, you know, results in, you know, duplication or inefficiency, and sometimes just like people struggle to, you know, keep things compatible and in sync, right? So in a way, I was, you know, we saw this in Vue CLI as well, because like maintaining a lot of this stuff was kind of challenging. So yeah, I guess kind of lost my track on what the point I was eventually trying to get to. But yeah.
Well, maybe you can just tell me. So there's this new documentary that came out that I've linked in the show notes. Watch it after you finish listening to the podcast. It's about Vite, which Vite. It's like the French pronunciation. Like, what is that? Why build that?
Yeah. So Vite is essentially my definition of what is minimally needed for you to start building a non-trivial web app, right? So I want to kind of classify it as like it's not absolutely necessary that you use Vite, right? But we try to make it as widely applicable to applications of all scales as possible. Like if you're just building a single HTML page, you probably don't need it. But if you're writing any decent amount of JavaScript, it will help you, right? The idea here is like traditionally we, in the past, when people say scaffold a React application 10 years ago, like it'll probably look at like you'll have Webpack, you'll have like Babel, you have like 10 different Babel plugins, and then a minifier, this and that and everything. So you know, you just have to know what all of these things do and assemble them together just to get the base boilerplate going. Okay. So React team created something called Create React App. It is, you know, it was the official recommended way to start with React, developing with React. And what it did was like it encapsulated a lot of complexity. It wrapped Webpack, it wrapped Jest, it wrapped all the configuration that glues all the things together on top of it. So in a way, Vite is similar. It is trying to give you this more sensible starting point that just, you know, handles all the things that we have come to a consensus where this is probably what you need if you're building a serious web app, right? So why don't we keep installing like all these dependencies separately? Why don't we have just like one thing that just, you know, kind of does do a lot of stuff that we kind of take for granted out of the box, right? And the important thing is I don't think it's easy to come up with stuff like this, like before we kind of reach consensus on what problems should be solved, right? So Vite came around a time where like the community have collectively come up with a lot of different things, and eventually we arrived at a certain point to say, well, this is pretty much more or less what everyone is doing. Why don't we just make it more opinionated in a single tool? And that's when Vite came out. It just did TypeScript and JSX transpilation out of the box. It did minification built in. It has a dev server with hot module placement set up for you, so you don't need to like configure the dev server itself and hook it up with a bundler. It has essentially the base starting point of what nowadays everyone just take for granted, but it was not the case like 10 years ago, right? So I think at that point people saw how with just a single dependency you were able to just get what's the baseline of all the years of complexity that we kind of went through, right? Also at much faster speed, a better experience. So this is also another aspect of it, is Vite kind of pioneered a sort of new model where during development, we load modules directly over native ES modules through browser native mechanism, right? And we just transpile things on the fly. So you can actually just import a TS file or JSX file or a Vue file. If you do that directly in a browser, it won't work, right? Browser doesn't understand what a Vue file is, but the Vite dev server does, right? So when it receives that request, it just compiles it into JavaScript on the fly and send it back. And now the browser understands it and can execute it, right? So we're essentially leveraging the browser's native module system by making a more smarter development server. We also leverage some additional tooling underneath. For example, like we rely on ESBuild to pre-bundle the dependencies so that we can reduce the amount of requests we send during development. We rely on Rollup for the production build, right? So even the initial version of Vite, it's still relying on a lot of things, third-party dependencies itself. We're just like trying to use more sensible combination and default plumbing to make it work better. That is the state of like Vite in the beginning up to the current version 7, right? But we're working on something that kind of changes this as well. But we can get into that later.
Yeah. Well, I want to just dive straight into it. First of all, I want to give people context if they're unfamiliar with Vite, just the adoption it's had. This is covered in the documentary, but like having the Svelte team and like a lot of other projects just essentially say like, wow, this is the standard we want. We're all moving over to Vite, the Snowpack team and stuff like that. Like just kind of like this has become kind of table stakes infrastructure that a lot of projects are built on. So I just wanted to say that very, very quickly. You don't have to respond to that. But what I do want to ask is, so you mentioned that you rely on ESBuild for the pre-bundled dependencies for the developer experience. And for anybody who hasn't spent a lot of time building sophisticated web apps, you need a fast developer experience. You need it to be snappy. Production, it's okay if it takes a while to build, but you don't want to be doing all that when you're trying to build the software because you're constantly changing things. That's where like, hot module reloading and things like that become very important because they dramatically speed up the rate at which you can like iterate on your code and like check and see whether it works and stuff like that. So developer experience has been like a huge thing that has driven adoption of Vite because it does improve developer experience a lot. But you mentioned using Rollup for production. And now my understanding is you all are working on something called Rolldown, which is kind of your own new bundler. Can you talk about why we need a new bundler? I mean, you kind of mentioned it earlier that like, but why build a new bundler? That seems like a big, ambitious task. And now you've got to get more adoption and that, and maybe Vite will natively adopt it because you all are building it, but like how you get everybody else to converge around this new bundler.
So for context, right? So the reason we use two bundlers in current Vite, we use ESBuild. ESBuild is a bundler, right? It has its own like it also packs a lot of features like transform and minify and stuff. Rollup is a bundler as well. Vite is built around these two, where we also adopt the plugin interface is also the same Rollup plugin interface. The Vite plugin interface is a superset of Rollup plugin interface, right? So these are two very important pieces of underlying technology in today's Vite. And the reason we have to use both is ESBuild is extremely fast. When it came out, it was like the fastest possible thing that you can imagine. It's like orders of magnitude faster than existing JavaScript-based bundlers, right? And it packed like things like transform and minify all in the same thing. So part of the reason Vite's dev server starts fast is also thanks to ESBuild in a lot of ways. Right? However, ESBuild has its own limitations when it comes to production bundling, because when you ship things to production, you care more about how optimized the output is. So one key aspect of it is chunk splitting. You want to have better control over how your chunks split. You want to have better control over tree shaking. You want to also have better compression quality. So while ESBuild is an amazing piece of technology, the biggest weakness is really in chunk splitting algorithm. It doesn't really give you any sort of customizability in that aspect, right? So we kind of have to use Rollup because Rollup is much more mature in this front, in this area, right? And we also is compatible with Rollup's plugin system. However, Rollup is written in JavaScript, and it's just slow compared to ESBuild, right? And so we're kind of in a dilemma. We kind of have to we rely on both, but they're also slightly inconsistent, right? So because part of your code is processed by ESBuild during development, and all of your code is processed by Rollup in production. While we try our best to align the two, right? And both of them also do a great job as like conforming to standards as much as possible. There can still be very subtle differences during dev and production, right? So very early on, we felt like, okay, the actual solution to is this, like we need something with the speed of ESBuild and the plugin interface, the ecosystem, and the API of Rollup, right? That would be ideal, right? We may even want to add things that Webpack is good at. For example, Webpack is probably the best at chunk splitting control. It has the most customizable chunk splitting algorithm or option system. Right? So,
and real quick, just if you can explain what chunk splitting is for listeners and why it's so important for performance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so imagine you're building a really, really huge web application. You don't, say you have 20 megabytes of JavaScript. You don't want that to be all in a single file, because that means that the browser will need to just download that one single file and then parse and execute the whole thing just to be able to render anything at all. And it blocks the main thread. It's not good, right? So it downloads slower, it executes slower. By splitting into smaller chunks, right? And you have to want to also split them into optimally sized chunks, because you want, for example, usually most browsers can load 6 HTTP requests in parallel, right? So if you split into 6 chunks, that optimizes parallel loading. Also, some browsers can parse them sort of in parallel before executing them. And some of the chunks, if they're not immediately needed, can be deferred in terms of execution, right? Or you can even defer loading them altogether until it's needed, right? So all of this is about optimizing the initial loading of your application, so that even if you're building a bigger and bigger application, you still keep the initial loading performance under control, right? There's also something to do with more optimal caching. Because when you cache these chunks and when you push an update, you want as fewer chunks to be invalidated as possible, so the user will be able to use more cache chunks on the next visit. Right? So it's a pretty complicated topic, but only really relevant if you're building really large and performance-sensitive applications. But it's also really important if your application is making a lot of money. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. You want good user experience for your end users. You want good developer experience for yourself and for your fellow devs.
Yeah.
So this may seem like relatively esoteric, but like this is where things are going. Apps are going to get more and more sophisticated and complicated over
Yeah.
time.
And the thing is, like a lot of these optimizations, they may not apply for everyone, right? But, for me, I always want to make sure like, we can have a tool that can adapt to the complexity spectrum as much as possible. It should be easy to use for beginners, right? But it should not like block them from eventually advancing to build more complicated applications, right? You shouldn't have to like abandon your starting stack just because now you're building something different, right? Um, so yeah, like going back to the bundler topic, so we see unique advantages in ESBuild, in Rollup, in Webpack, and eventually we're like, hey, like feels like it would be ideal if there's a bundler that kind of does the good parts of all three of them, right? But it doesn't exist, right? So obviously there's the question like, why don't you improve some of these things? First of all, it is extremely difficult to match the performance of ESBuild by incrementally improving a JavaScript-based bundler. That's just, engineering from an engineering perspective, that's impractical because like JavaScript is single-threaded, and a lot of the performance gains from native bundlers is parallelization, right? So you have to pretty much like completely re-architecture how the bundler works in order to get that parallelization, which is close to a rewrite, right?
Yeah.
So which is,
And
there. Mhm.
yeah, and I was going to say ESBuild is written in Go. Like it's a
Yeah,
completely different language. It's much more high performance,
yeah,
than JavaScript is. So like to incrementally, like it's questionable as to whether you could ever even match that performance through
exactly.
incremental.
Yeah. So actually, so Rollup has tried to say swap its parser to a Rust-based one, uh, but that has shown to have minimal impact on actual performance because when you embed Rust parts inside a JavaScript system, you actually incur the cost of passing data back and forth, and you have to have very very significant performance gains to outweigh that that data passing cost. And in a lot of cases, it just kind of offsets the little gain if you only replace a part of it with Rust, right? So you kind of have to need the whole system to be rewritten in a native language to get, the ES build level of performance jump. So on the ES build side, it's a very, it's an amazing project, right? The ES build's author is actually the ex-CTO of Figma. So essentially 100x engineer, I would say. So the difficult part is he designed ESBuild. One of the reasons ESBuild is this fast is like it performs like 3 AST passes max. So it mixes all these different things like transform, minification, uh, constant replacement, module concatenation in like 3 AST passes. And it's scattered across these different passes, right, for performance, but it makes it quite difficult for other people to sort of contribute or change it structurally. Architecture wise, the original author is probably the best person who can make significant changes, and it's kind of difficult for others to even fork and add their own thing on top of it. Right? It's quite challenging. Also, when we thought about Vite, right, one of the interesting use case is people use Vite a lot because it's so light, right, in browser-based development environments like Stackblitz. Vite is actually able to run entirely in the browser without having to run on a server. And that's like very useful for people prototyping, play around with like, for example, SvelteKit, I think they built an entire tutorial running on top of Vite in the browser as well, right? This is an important use case for us. And Go has, when you write it in a native language, you have to compile it to WebAssembly. And Go's WebAssembly story is not as good. It works, but compared to Rust, right? Rust's WebAssembly generation is more efficient, smaller binary, better performance. So we also, I was also talking to folks, there are already people who are working on Rust tooling for JavaScript. People have written JavaScript parsers in Rust. right? There's SWC, there's OXC. So, you know, the reason we are building Rolldown is, like you said, like we are not that concerned about Rolldown's own adoption because it is essentially designed, tailor-made for Vite itself, right? We want to use Rolldown to serve as the future foundation of Vite. So a lot of it is just to, you know, resolve the inconsistencies, get the benefits of both ES-Build and Rollup, expand Vite's own capabilities to things like chunk splitting, module federation. So, you know, it just solves a lot of problems that we've always wanted to solve in Vite.
So, Evan, up to this point, we've been talking a lot about developer productivity and tools that help developers get things done more effectively without a lot of the tedium of waiting for things to reload and things like that, packages to install. But you're somebody who's an extremely effective developer in terms of getting things done. And I was wondering whether you have any like habits you picked up over time, or how you sit yourself down at the keyboard, how you actually get things done.
Yeah. So I actually don't consider myself very well organized in terms of like planning work. Like I said, I'm a very goal-driven person. So, like, say when I was working on Vue or Vite, usually I keep a long-term to-do list of the things, like the bigger items that I feel like, okay, this is what Vue needs, this is what Vite needs. And when I start working on one of those goals, then I have sort of like a short-term to markdown file. It's just a to-do list that's directly in the project itself. And as I work on things and tick things off, I would always come up with more smaller things to add to that list. So it kind of just grows and grows, like until like that sort of bigger milestone is hit. Right. So I guess like when I'm in the zone, it's more like I'm just like trying to follow the to-do list I created for myself, and keep doing that until I'm done, or until I feel like I need to take a break. Um, yeah, when I was younger, in my 20s, I did work very long hours because I just, uh, generally enjoy building stuff. That's open source, and but later on, I guess things started to involve a bit more of like set building teams, coordinating efforts, trying to align the incentives, trying to you know forward and redirect sponsorships, making sure people are financially compensated to work on certain things. So I guess like in the past 5 or 6 years, there started to be more of a bit of a like sort of management, or just trying to make people happy across the ecosystem, across the organization, across the team. And then after I started the company, more of such duty. So a lot of the focus of the company really, like the things we're building at Void Zero, I write very, very little code for Void Zero, right? A lot of it is finding people who I think are actually smarter than me on certain problems, right? And one of the reasons I started company is because I realized, despite I myself have been writing a lot of code to solve my own problems and somehow turned out great, I can't write all the code, right? And so in a way, but the goals actually got bigger. While you know, some of those problems, like writing a fast Rust parser, that's like out of my original expertise, because like I mostly write JavaScript and TypeScript. Right? I try to learn Rust. I still wouldn't call myself a great Rust developer. Like I know how it works, but um, I realized, okay, like, but I know what the eventual goal is. I have a lot of opinions on how that should be done. So, starting the company allowed me to gather convince the right people that I believe are better qualified than me to build, say, right or fast Rust parser, in order to sort of eventually achieve the common goal, whereas like let's have fast, unified, efficient tooling for JavaScript that's better than what we had before, right? Yeah, so a lot of it has changed, and the work has started to become more fragmented and more complicated. But I've been working from home since 2015, I think. So a whole decade of working from home. So working in the same spot does help you, stay more organized. But I think one important thing if you're working from home is what I found helpful is setting a good boundary of like, this is like, say I have a dedicated room where I work. If I'm in the room, I'm working. If I'm out of the room, I'm not working. Right? So that's kind of this little boundary I set for myself.
Yeah, that's a cool tip. So similarly, I've got like this room. I'm very, fortunate in that I have a dedicated room in my house where I can just sit down and
Yeah.
work. I know not everybody has that luxury.
Yeah.
And it sounds like just that to-do list driven development, like where you're kind of gradually expanding on your original plan as you get more and more details. It's becoming more
Mhm.
granular and maybe more indentations deep.
Yeah.
The bullet points that you're working on, that's a really cool way to get
Yeah.
things done. So would you describe your workflow like just having like an open, text editor essentially, and using Markdown and just
Mhm.
adding and checking off tasks as you go through
Yeah.
there? Do you delete the task?
Yeah.
Do you like strike through them? How do you do that?
I just use the Markdown syntax for to-do lists, right? So there's the bracket, and you just add an X in it. The nice thing is
Ah,
you can actually render it. So you kind of have you can it can be rendered nicely, but I just keep raw Markdown open. So that's when I'm writing code. I do use Google Keep a lot. I keep all the non-code related to-dos in Google Keep. That's like my personal to-do list. Uh, like at Voice Zero, we use Linear, right? But Linear is like more for like, you know, arranging workflow and sort of like setting goals, deadlines, and stuff. Uh, I still have the habit of like just, you know, whatever time I feel like, oh, this thing I need to done, I just keep like this today list in Google Keep, which almost is never fully ticked off, but that's the way it is.
yeah. And I want to talk about open source project management, if you will. Like you've
Mm-hmm.
created two very popular open source projects. I guess one of my questions is like you could have kind of rested on your laurels and just been the Vue guy, and just stayed with that and left it to somebody else to build Vite or something like that. Left it to somebody else to build
Mm-hmm.
Rolldown. But you didn't. Like you kind of like got back on, you like jumped off one horse and jumped on another, or you started like like getting several horses to run in tandem so you could like straddle them. I'm trying to think of an analogy, but basically
Yeah.
you're doing a lot and the amount of stuff you're doing keeps growing, and
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people would be content to kind of like stay with like the project that is going well. What
Mm-hmm.
inspired you? What gave you the I guess the courage, the audacity to keep starting new projects?
Yeah, I kind of want to ask myself because, like, I feel like I'm always taking on more than I can chew, in a way. Um, but I think part of it is because I'm very lucky to have built projects that kind of naturally formed communities. Like even for Vue, like although I wrote a lot of the code, but Vue is more than just a core library. There is a whole suite of things like there's the official router, there's the state management library, there is the language tools, the IDE extension, there's the developer tools extension that runs in Chrome, the graphical one, and then there's the Vite related plugins. There was Vue CLI, right? So it's actually a pretty big scope, and like over the years, I kind of narrowed my focus only on the Vue core library, and then there are people who the Vue core team members who maintain some of these other pieces, right? So and I never intentionally recruited people to work on these things. Well, I actually recruited one person to help me maintain Vue core full time, but um, Edison, he's now on our team maintaining Vue core full time. But most of the other core team members, I mean, even before Edison started working full time on Vue core, he was just a part time contributor. He was just generally interested in these problems, and he started sending more and more PRs. And similarly, all these other people who maintain these different pieces, they kind of just stepped into those roles naturally, and I was able to delegate, right? So without the delegation, I wouldn't be able to even have the bandwidth to even consider taking on other things. Right? So similarly for Vite, right? We have a Vite team. We have a great community. We actually have all these framework authors on the Discord server discussing and sharing ideas. We have people who worked on Vite part-time first, then found roles that allow them to contribute to Vite full-time at other companies, and some of them also got hired by Voice Zero. Some of them are working at other companies working on Vite full-time. So so it's interesting that we once the project got kind of bigger than I initially anticipated, right? There are also more people that kind of joined and stepped up and to kind of help me keep maintaining it and keep making it better. So in a way, I guess that's what allowed me to, start thinking about even bigger problems, because I see the power of just like having people who are interested in solving the same thing work together. Um, yeah, but I would never be able to do this alone.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about open source communities and
Mhm.
advice you would have to other people who would like to ultimately create a project as successful as Vue or Vite, if that's even possible, and essentially get people behind it, get people contributing alongside them.
Mhm.
And I'm also particularly interested in, you're famous for getting all these sponsors lined up to support
Mhm.
Vue. I
Yeah.
think at some point you were making like 20 or 30K a month in sponsorships from people that were like dev shops that were using Vue, and of course like companies that were building tools on top of Vue and things like that.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, Advice you would have in terms of sustainability for maintainers as well.
Yeah. So I think I would say the very first thing I say to people who are thinking about doing something similar to Vue is don't do open source because you want to, say, be successful or make money or whatever. Uh, the most important thing about open source is you are generally just trying to solve a problem that you think is worth solving. That's what should get you into open source, right? So if you're saying I want to be like Evan and make a lot of money doing open source, it's probably not going to work out. It's like founding a startup. You're basically having the goal of making money first and then trying to sort of find a solution to get there, right? But open source can be, it can be non-rewarding at times. It can be brutal sometimes. I've seen over the years, I've seen many people who maintain very popular, like even successful open source projects, but they don't get much in return. Instead, they dedicate a lot of their spare time just trying to, answer people's questions and fixing bug reports and all that. Uh, Not every open source project can be monetized. That's just a hard truth. Um, in a lot of cases, it's easier for things like a framework. The scope is big, it has a lot of exposure to developers. People interact with it every day if they're using it. It's easier to build a community around it. That's why Vue is able to attract sponsorships, right? But not every open source project's kind of is in that category. Like let's say you're maintaining a low level utility library that's maybe downloaded like millions of times a month on npm, but that really it's very very difficult for you to say get sponsorship for that one library. Right? So it's a very different. So how do you monetize open source is also very very case dependent, right? It really like boils down to what problem are you solving, right? How big of a problem you're solving, and can you find the right incentives for people to want to give you money? It may be sponsorships, but like like what we'll be seeing, even for like there are a lot of startups that's built on top of open source as well. But most of the successful open source project companies you see uh, are probably building something that runs on the server side, right? That databases, server side frameworks, these are easier to monetize because the natural solution is you build a hosting platform, a managed solution for that, right? But if you're building something like a front-end library, it becomes much more challenging because the incentives are completely different for users of your library, um, right? So it is oftentimes, I would say, when people ask me how do I monetize open source, it's like asking how do I make a startup, right? It's completely open ended. Every open source project have different value propositions, just like startups, and you will have to find unique ways to make your product market fit, make your business plan work, right? So like Tailwind has been really successful, but who would have thought writing a atomic CSS solution can make it a profitable company, right? In a lot of ways, you need to have the same sort of business savvy kind of mindset in order to figure out how to best, have a sustainable open source project, right? But kind of want to scale back because like you want to also be very you want to like be honest with yourself and just be explicit about your goal of doing open source because um, you need to start with a default that you probably won't get much back in return. That's just the way it is, right? Best case scenario is if you make a successful project but you don't get any sort of direct sponsorship or monetization, it may just be a nice thing to have on your resume, right? So when you like interview at a company, maybe they will be like, "Hey, we're using your software." That can be helpful too. That's just like a kind of indirect way of value that your open source project creates for yourself. So yeah, so in a lot of ways, I just think it's a very hard to it's a question that's very difficult to generalize.
Well, let's talk about Void Zero then, because
Mhm.
it sounds like, based on what you said, you created this startup and you got funding so that you could attract a lot of people who had different specializations and bring them together under the same roof
Yeah.
to build this tool chain for web development. Is that an
Mhm.
accurate summary of your motivations there?
Yeah, yeah.
And what are
So
your
yeah.
long-term plans
Mhm.
with it?
So in a way, I want to I would say the default goal is to have a group of people who are able to work fully dedicated on building the best possible toolchain for web development while being properly compensated, while having this whole effort being sufficiently sustainable for as long as possible, right? So the reason for doing that is part of that is my own experience of maintaining things like Vue and Vite. I realize, and I also, have worked with a lot of people working on different things in the web ecosystem. At one point, I was uh, I was talking to Harry Zhu, who used to be the lead maintainer of Babel for a period of time, and he spent a lot of time trying to get sponsorships for Babel. For those who don't know, Babel is the JavaScript transpiler uh, tool that a lot of people rely on. Probably everyone used it at some point. Um, it's literally used by every company, but it struggles to get funding. Um, and that's just sad. And there are so many things in the JavaScript ecosystem that kind of struggle with that. And there's part of it I feel like, you know, I want to see people who can I want to see a tool chain that's actually built by people who are working on it. They can, just spend all their time thinking about how just to make it better instead of thinking about how do I get more sponsors, right? So in a way, like I'm taking over that responsibility at the company. Like I try to raise money, find a business model that kind of make it sustainable, so that the people that I have convinced to join this effort can stop thinking about those things and just like do what they love, do what they want to do. Um, so that's one part of it. The other part of it is from an ecosystem perspective. I think JavaScript is now literally the largest, application language in the world. Like everyone is building stuff with JavaScript. AI is building stuff with JavaScript. There's going to be more and more JavaScript code written, right? It's a pretty critical piece of software. It's a pretty critical piece in the entire like software ecosystem chain. Right? So, but we are still relying on a lot of these like sort of like you said hodgepodge dependency soup. Not every company's doing that, but like for a lot of companies, it's still kind of very difficult to just like say, what do we even use, right? Even to today, it's still pretty challenging question. So my intention of building Voice Zero and building the things we're building now is not say we want to say take over the world and dominate everything. That's not the goal. The goal is to give people who want unification an option, right? When we say the unified tool chain, it's not like we're going to unify everyone else. We are building something that is, coherent in itself, so that for those who opt to use it, they get a very streamlined and coherent and unified experience. And we hope that sort of resonates with a lot of developers who are currently working in an environment where they are like struggling with this kind of problems, right? Yeah, so that's important. I know like the stuff we're building builds a lot of it builds on the design and conventions that have accumulated over the years in the ecosystem, and inevitably some of the tools we build are potentially replaces older tools that existed before us. Some of those are still maintained, right? But our intention is not to compete or replace. Our intention is to get the best possible developer experience, to see where we can land. And once we build that, and we want to give it to people who think they need it.
Awesome. So that you just did a great job of like kind of laying out the future and how you're kind of essentially allowing people on your team to just focus on the problems at hand, and you're kind of taking over as like the funding and management and like big picture planning type person, so that you can break tasks down and delegate them. And not everybody has to be worried about sustainability. Not everybody has to be worried about like a grand long-term roadmap. They can be more focused on the task at hand.
Inevitably, they some of them may want to be more participating in that thought process. They want to understand the big picture, and that is fine too, right? But personally for me, when I was working on a specific problem, it's very stressful if I have to also think about, do I get enough sponsorship to pay my bills next month?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the things I want to talk to you about is you have a unique perspective on China, in that Vue was extremely popular and probably still is in China. And it like to the extent that I believe like a lot of the companies that I visited, whenever I go to China, like they are using Vue in their tool chain. And I imagine they're probably also using Vite now. So you got to experience kind of like firsthand the adoption. Like I remember reading about you going to China and being like this celebrity there, and like everybody like at the university would like surround you and want to talk to you and stuff like that. Like again, I don't want to like talk you up too much, but like my impression from the outside is you were like maybe one of the most famous developers in the world for Chinese devs. And so you have had that experience of being a dev who has been able to interact, and of course you can speak Chinese, so you're able to talk with these people on an intimate level and understand like what is your take on the current state of the developer field in China, and how would you compare and contrast that with like the US, where you've spent a great deal of time, and maybe with Singapore where you are now, in terms of like the sensibilities and the desires and the tendencies? And I realize we could talk about this for like an hour, but just the big topics that you want to share about it. Like I'd be very interested in your take.
Yeah, I would say the Chinese developers are very pragmatic. A lot of them, I would say, because of the huge population, there are a lot of developers who got into the field just because they're looking for a job. But there are also, a very large amount of very talented developers who probably are not so publicly visible because of the language barrier to the Eastern world. There's also definitely the the language barrier also kind of constitutes some of the learning barrier for them as well. So, but in general, you actually see very active. A lot of people are pretty active on GitHub. Uh, they may just participate less in terms of like doing this sort of like more diplomatic communication for open source and all that. But there is a pretty strong open source ecosystem in China. It's just kind of a bit siloed, right? There's definitely still like projects from China that got popular, but it's a bit siloed. And on the other hand, a lot of the more, I would say the open source sustainability issue is probably more severe in China because developers in China actually don't have access to GitHub sponsors by default, right? So it's kind of difficult for them to have a high visibility, sustainable donation channel for them. So very few people are able to actually live off of that in China. So most of the more long-term stable open source projects are actually from these big tech companies in China. But I guess there's also some issue in that some of these companies, like some of people at these companies, kind of build these open source projects for their promotion, and they're not necessarily well maintained, but still, like I guess it depends. There are some pretty notable open source projects from Chinese tech companies that are now like in the Apache Foundation and are actually quite widely adopted as well. I would say the most unfortunate thing I've seen is Chinese companies in general have a much lower tendency to like donate to open source Chinese developers as well. There's definitely the payment barrier where, like say, I mostly take donations on GitHub sponsors. It's actually difficult for them to even want to give me money, right? Companies too. So over the years, the proportion of donations we get from China is relatively low compared to other countries, despite the amount of user base that we have, which is unfortunate. I wish this could change for the better, but that's the way it is.
So, what would you say to somebody who's building a developer tool? Maybe they are, overseas Chinese or an ethnic
Mhm.
Chinese, like American, who can speak Chinese and who is thinking, oh, I could go to China and potentially go to like, a big Apache conference. Like I went to an Apache conference in Beijing a couple months ago, right?
Yeah.
And like talk to all these different developers and vendors and maybe like get support for my open source tool. Like, what advice would you have to that person? Like, do you think that that is still like an avenue they should explore, or do you think that their time might be spent elsewhere? And this would also include like,
Mhm.
like Singapore, Taiwan, other places that have like where they could use their Chinese skills and their knowledge of like Chinese culture and things like that to potentially be an edge in terms of being able to get people's attention and yeah, make those
Yeah,
relationships.
I would say the biggest reason you'd want to do that is probably just tap into the talent pool of potential contributors. There are like the absolute amount of Chinese engineers who are just good engineers is insane because it's a huge country and with a lot of smart people. Um, so for example, like in the Vue core team, in the Vite core team, in the Voice Zero team, we have a pretty high percentage of like Chinese devs, right? People who got into open source and then started contributing, and then we hired them. So, and in a way, these are great devs, but you probably won't be able to even, get in contact with them if you go through normal recruiting channels in say, in the US, right? So, if you want to some of them may well have to work from China, but like if you're open to like remote work, right? I think that's actually pretty cool. And then the other side of it is, I do think some Chinese companies if they use open source heavily, they would sometimes be willing to like make significant contributions. This is probably harder than Western companies, but if you look at uh, like even Huawei actually contributes to Linux very significantly. But it's challenging. It's a bit challenging because it's a bit more difficult to convince the management that they should spend time on things like this. I would say like a good example I can think of is Zach Jackson, who is the author of Module Federation, who is worked on Webpack's Module Federation feature, and because ByteDance is such a heavy Webpack user company, he actually joined ByteDance to essentially keep working on Module Federation and their general web dev infra stuff there, and he seems to be really happy. So a lot of these Chinese companies have their internal like web infra dev teams, and they do try to make a lot of open source stuff.
Awesome. So just to recap, it's the Chinese developer scene can be a great source of talent if you know how to get in there and get the right people. And you yourself as an open source contributor may be able to land a developer job at some of these companies, many of which have like US branches, for example. Last question. I know it's super late there in Singapore. I really appreciate you hanging in there with my many questions, but this is such an opportunity to talk to you. You maintain two of the more popular open source projects on Earth, really. And I know that AI has had a big impact on like the way that people contribute to open source. We get lots of AI essentially authored pull requests and things like that. People using AI assistants to create pull requests and things like that. Like, how has AI impacted you? And I'm speaking specifically about like LLM tools that can be used for code generation and text generation and things like that. How has that impacted you as a maintainer? And do you see that as like a net positive or a net negative, or what's your sentiment on that?
I would say it's definitely a net positive so far. I actually use AI less for coding, but a bit more for sort of brainstorming solutions or possible ideas that I could have missed. Because a lot of times, in a lot of ways, LLMs, right? They are good, but in a lot of cases, it's not like 100% accurate, right? It can hallucinate, right? So I actually find what's most helpful for AI is just to, ask it to sort of come up with possible directions. Because I'm often surprised on things that AI suggests, but I never would thought of myself. I think that's just like, it opens up a lot of new perspectives or directions that you can think through when you're faced with a relatively complex problem. I kind of use it as a thinking assistant tool more than a coding assistant tool. As for writing the actual code, I find it much better at dealing with the more isolated the scope is, the more reliable it is, right? The larger the context window is, the more historical context there is, the less reliable it gets. So unfortunately, a lot of the maintenance work that I do all have very involved historical context. Like a bug fix may have maybe related to like several other issues that dates back years. And sometimes it's kind of challenging to feed all this proper context into AI to make it fully understand what needs to be done. But when you're writing new code, when you're writing like unit tests, it can definitely help you. If you're working on a very well-defined scope of like greenfield thing, like you running a new utility library, it's like amazing. Helps, just saves you so much time. We're actually so the Voice Zero team actually is pretty actively trying to integrate or just play around with AI, not necessarily because we want to force everyone to use it, just because we want to also like experience it firsthand to see where the limit really is, right? Is it really that good, right? What works, what doesn't, what can we do in our tool chain to make it work with people who are using AI to use Vite and other tools that we built. So this is kind of, we need to be AI users ourselves to be able to build tools that work well with AI. So that's the motivation for us.
Awesome. That's super helpful. So using it as less for coding and more for brainstorming solutions. You said that AI can be helpful when you have like a greenfield, well-scoped project. You mentioned it being helpful for tests, but that a lot of times it just lacks the historical context. It lacks the greater understanding of why the system is implemented the way it is. And so that dramatically limits its actual applicability. So like that's a very balanced take, and that's pretty much in line with like what I've heard from a lot of more experienced devs talking about it. So I really appreciate your thoughts on that. It's been such an honor talking with you, Evan. Again, like longtime fan of your work, your thoughts. I enjoy reading your Chinese Twitter for like reading comprehension practice.
Nice.
So thank you again so much for staying up super late there in Singapore to be on the Free Code Camp podcast.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, awesome. Well, everybody tuning in. Until next week, happy coding.